Now let's talk about account types. There are many different types of accounts. Our focus is going to be on two accounts, the cash account and the margin account. What does it mean, cash account? If a customer opens a cash account, that means that if they buy securities in that account, they're going to have to pay for trades in full. No borrowing allowed. So trades would have to be paid in full, no borrowing allowed. Now, there's some accounts that are required to be cash accounts. Custodial accounts, accounts for minors, must be opened as a cash account. Retirement accounts must be opened as cash accounts. We could never open a custodial account as a margin account. We could never open a retirement account as a margin account. These accounts must be opened as cash accounts, and whatever is bought in the account must be paid for in full, no borrowing allowed. So if I bought $10,000 worth of stock in a cash account, how much would I have to deposit to pay for that trade? $10,000. Now, we're not saying that you've got to deposit cash. I'm not saying that. This is just, the name of the account indicating that payment must be made in full, no borrowing allowed. I mean, I could, pay for this with a check, or I could pay for it with a money order. It doesn't have to be, the form of payment doesn't have to be cash. I could wire money in. I mean, there's any number of ways I could pay for this. So don't get the fact that the name of the account is cash account, confused, but that's the only way we can pay. No, that just means we got to pay for the trade in full. Now let's look at margin accounts. With a margin account, an investor can buy using credit. They can buy using borrowed money. This allows the investor to buy using someone else's money. This is leverage. Using leverage will magnify our gains. It also magnifies our losses. So margin accounts are considered to be more speculative than cash accounts. Now, when buying on margin, how much would a customer have to deposit? The amount the customer must deposit is established by Regulation T. The amount the customer must deposit is established by Reg T. Reg T, unless you're told otherwise, is 50%. So the customer would be required to deposit 50% of the purchase price. They could borrow the other 50% of the purchase price from the broker-dealer. So if I buy $10,000 worth of stock on margin, I would have to deposit $5,000. I could borrow the remaining $5,000 from my broker-dealer. Now, some securities are marginable and some securities are not. What would be marginable securities? Listed stocks would be marginable. Any stock listed on an exchange, the New York or the American Stock Exchange, is marginable. Over-the-counter stocks that are NASDAQ stocks are marginable. What about over-the-counter stocks that are non-NASDAQ stocks, where they would only be marginable if approved by the FRB, the Federal Reserve Board? Let's talk about the initial margin requirement. Now, a few moments ago, we talked about Reg T. And Reg T, that's the amount the customer must deposit when buying in a margin account. But if it is the initial trade, how much does the customer have to deposit? Well, they've got to meet the Reg T requirement or FINRA's requirement, whichever is greater. Reg T's requirement or FINRA's requirement, whichever is greater. Now, FINRA says on the initial trade, we must deposit at least $2,000. On the initial trade in a margin account, we must deposit at least $2,000, unless what we're buying is less than $2,000, and then we simply pay for the trade. Let's take a look at some examples. So, on the initial trade in a margin account, customer buys $5,000 worth of stock. The Reg T requirement is 50%. So Reg T requirement would be $2,500. So the customer on the initial trade has got to meet the Reg T requirement or FINRA's minimum requirement of a $2,000 deposit, whichever is greater. Well, $2,500 is greater, Reg T is greater, so the customer would have to deposit $2,500. They would get a margin call for $2,500. They would have to meet Reg T. What if instead the initial trade was $3,000? Well, Reg T requirement on $3,000 is $1,500. Remember, on the initial trade, we meet Reg T or FINRA's $2,000 requirement, whichever is greater. Well, Reg T is only $1,500. Client bought 3, Reg T 50%, $1,500. Well, $2,000, the FINRA requirement is greater, therefore the margin call would be $2,000. Client would have to deposit $2,000. A third example, client buys as their initial trade in a margin account $1,800 worth of stock. Reg T is 50%. 1,800 times 50% is $900. Well, how much is the client going to have to deposit? On the initial trade, meet Reg T or FINRA's required $2,000, whichever is greater, unless what's being bought is less than $2,000, then we pay for the trade. So in this case, the customer has got to deposit the amount of the trade. They'll get a margin call for $1,800. Now, in addition to the initial money that must be deposited, margin accounts must maintain a minimum equity. FINRA requires a minimum equity be maintained in the account. The minimum equity for a long margin account, a margin account in which you bought securities, is 25% of the market value. The minimum equity that FINRA requires in a short margin account, a margin account where we've sold securities we do not own, is 30%. So the equity would be 30% of the current market value. Now, in addition to the maintenance requirements of FINRA, broker-dealers can have their own maintenance requirements for margin accounts. These are known as house rules. Now, if an account ends up with a maintenance call, if their equity drops below the minimum required and they end up with a maintenance call, maintenance calls are due immediately. Maintenance calls are due immediately, today. No settlement date, no 2 days later, 3 days later, 4 days later. Maintenance calls are due immediately, today. Now, in order for a client to open a margin account, they must complete a margin agreement. Now, there are 3 parts to the margin agreement. There's the credit agreement, the hypothecation agreement, and the loan consent agreement. Buys stock in a margin account using money borrowed from the broker-dealer, they're going to have to pay interest on that loan. They're going to have to pay margin interest on that loan. And the credit agreement deals with the loan. Credit agreement deals with the loan. Mr. Ms. Client, you're going to be borrowing money from us when you purchase in a margin account. We're going to charge you interest. Hypothecation agreement. Now, when a customer borrows money from the broker-dealer, they've got to pledge their securities as collateral for the loan. They've got to pledge securities in the account as collateral for the loan. The agreement whereby the client is pledging securities as collateral is known as the hypothecation agreement. This is the agreement that the client signs pledging their securities as collateral for the loan. If you remember, back in the early part of the EDGE here, we talked about different interest rates. One of the interest rates we talked about was the broker call loan rate. Remember, this was where broker-dealer loaned money to customers as part of their margin trading. The broker-dealer would go to a bank and finance that margin debt. Well, when the broker-dealer goes to finance that margin debt at a bank, the bank is going to want the broker-dealer to pledge the customer securities as collateral. So the broker-dealer will rehypothecate the customer's securities to the bank. And this is allowed in the hypothecation agreement. Rehypothecate the customer's securities to the bank. They'll repledge the customer's securities as collateral to the bank. And finally, the loan consent agreement. This is optional. Customer does not have to sign this to open a margin account, but if they do, they are consenting, they are allowing the broker-dealer to loan their stocks out to other investors. And this would typically be done in conjunction with short selling. Now, could a corporate account or a partnership account or a fiduciary account, such as a trust or an estate, could those accounts be opened as margin accounts? Yes, but only if the documents that created the organization or created the trust or the estate, only if those documents allowed for margin trading.